The Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. It's a beautiful day, so I decided to record this podcast in the park, so if you hear any strange noises, that's why. I'm reading from a book called Unsolved Mysteries of World War II, and a particular chapter called The Battle of Los Angeles by Michael Fitzgerald. The Battle of Los Angeles was a curious event that took place between the 24th and the 25th of February, 1942. Explanations for it vary wildly. It occurred less than 3 months after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and only a day after Japanese submarine 1-17 bombarded Elwood. The first thought was that an air raid had been launched from Japan, but this idea was quickly dismissed by the Secretary of the Navy. The night of the 24th to the 25th of February saw a flurry of air raid sirens. Air raid wardens rushed into position, and a total blackout of the area was ordered. Then at 3:16 a.m., the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade took the decision to begin firing 50-caliber machine guns and 12.8-pound anti-aircraft shells at the unidentified flying object. Pilots were also alerted, but no planes were sent up into the air. The firing continued until 4:14 a.m. when the all-clear signal was sounded, and the blackout was lifted by 7:21 a.m. The shells damaged buildings and vehicles, and 5 people lost their lives, 2 as a result of heart attacks induced by the stress of the hostilities, and 3 in car accidents. Within a few hours of the raid being terminated, the Navy Secretary held a press briefing in which he attributed the incident to what he called war nerves. General George C. Marshall suggested that commercial planes might have been used as a psychological warfare tactic. The press remained suspicious. There was speculation that the unprepared U.S. authorities had been caught out by secret Japanese attacks and were trying to conceal their own inefficiency. Ideas about hidden bases in Mexico and a fleet of Japanese submarines offshore armed with long-range weapons were put forward. Another theory was that the government had staged the whole thing deliberately to give it an excuse to move industries situated on the coast to sites further inland. Pearl Harbor was still fresh in people's minds, and the submarine attack on Elwood the day before had created a sense of panic. In this atmosphere, it's not surprising that the event became a major news story and that conspiracy theories were soon woven around it. The devastation caused by the raid on Pearl Harbor was magnified by Japanese naval activity, and Japan sent 7 submarines to patrol the west coast of America. Twice, the submarines became involved in fights with American naval or air forces, and they sank several merchant ships. By late December, they returned to Japan for maintenance and supplies. Japanese submarine 1-17 then returned to American waters. Before the war, its commander, Kotso Nishino, had been in charge of a merchant ship and had refilled his vessel with oil before returning to Japan. While walking to the refinery, he tripped and fell into some prickly pear cactus. The oil workers laughed when he had cactus spines removed from his behind, and there was speculation that this incident may have led Nishino to target the oil refinery when his submarine was within range of it. Nishino ordered his gun crew to aim at an aviation fuel tank, and their initial gunfire landed close to the storage tanks. The few oil workers on duty at first thought that the noise was due to an internal explosion. Then one of them saw the submarine. When the second tank was targeted, the refinery staff called the police, but several rounds had been fired by the time that decision was taken. More shells hit a nearby ranch, while another passed over Wheeler's Inn, and the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office was alerted. Another shell struck and damaged the Elwood Pier. The firing destroyed a derrick and a pump house and damaged a catwalk. The whole operation lasted for 20 minutes before Nishino gave the order to his crew to cease firing. 13 shells in all were fired. As soon as news of the attack spread, planes were sent to the area to pursue the raider. 3 more bombers joined the attempt to destroy the submarine, but none were able to hit their target. Air Force commanders only deployed these small quantities of aircraft because they feared that the raid was a diversionary one to decoy their resources away from the real target. Japanese Americans who were loyal to the United States immediately warned that the very next day might see an aerial assault on Los Angeles. The Elwood attack created panic out of all proportion to its effectiveness. With the memory of the raid fresh in people's minds, the following day saw a sustained aerial battle against an unknown and still unidentified intruder. At 3:16 a.m., Los Angeles heard the sound of air raid sirens. Anti-aircraft and machine guns began firing at targets from Santa Monica to Culver City. During this alert, over 1,400 rounds were fired. Thousands of people saw the anti-aircraft batteries firing, and there are many eyewitness accounts of the strange events of that early morning in February. They are, perhaps understandably, not consistent and often appear confused. There's very little agreement on the details of what was seen. Some witnesses describe a craft that resembled a Zeppelin airship, while others insist that the object was more like a balloon. A number describe seeing aircraft. More baffling reports claim the object resembled a giant butterfly, or a coffee pot. In the confusion and panic, it is understandable that witnesses gave different accounts of what they saw. It's perhaps more surprising that not only some anti-aircraft gunners, but also various pilots described the events differently. Some observers describe seeing a single plane, and others report seeing an entire squadron of Japanese aircraft or a fleet of airships that they insist were being chased by U.S. fighters. Nobody suggested extraterrestrial invaders. That particular spin on the story came years later. Following the bizarre battle, newspapers put forward a series of wild theories to account for the strange events. Some claimed that Japanese aircraft had flown right across Los Angeles and that the military were too embarrassed to admit that they had been caught out by the invaders. A popular conspiracy theory was that defense manufacturers had organized a phony raid using civilian planes to frighten the government into allowing them to move their factories further inland. The Washington Post described the authorities as having maintained what it called a stubborn silence, and as having panicked in the face of uncertain events. The New York Times stated, "If the batteries were firing on nothing at all, as Secretary Knox implies, it's a sign of expensive incompetence and jitters. If the batteries were firing on real planes, some of them as low as 9,000 feet, as Secretary Stimson declares, why were they completely ineffective? Why did no American planes go up to engage them, or even to identify them? What would have happened if this had been a real air raid?" The reality was that American anti-aircraft defenses were totally unprepared for any kind of air raid. Had the strange events of that night been a genuine Japanese attack, it would have caused widespread destruction. At the end of the war, when they were specifically asked about the Los Angeles affair, the Japanese authorities said that none of their planes were in the area at that time. A few were launched from submarines operated off Seattle at a later date, but on the night in question, not a single Japanese aircraft was anywhere near the zone. As there's no evidence that Japanese fighters or bombers were involved, and since so little damage was done, it's virtually certain that the events of the Battle of Los Angeles were not the result of enemy invasion. What really happened? The official explanation after the war was that meteorological balloons released over Los Angeles had been mistaken for enemy aircraft. It was certain that the targets at which the anti-aircraft units had fired were moving too slowly to have been Japanese planes. Once the firing had begun, the smoke in the atmosphere made accurate identification more difficult, and with the general air of panic, it's not surprising that firing continued in spite of the lack of evidence of any actual enemy in the air. The commander of the brigade in the area admitted that initially he thought he had seen 15 planes in the sky, but soon realized that the smoke from the gunfire was misleading him. And some witnesses who saw the intensive gunfire said that they could never distinguish the shape of an aircraft. It's also curious that the planes made no attempt to bomb the area, even though it contained valuable military installations. Stimson's suggestion that the aircraft were engaged in reconnaissance is plausible, but is unsupported by any evidence. The failure of the majority of witnesses to observe any indisputable signs of planes makes that theory highly unlikely. Another suggested explanation is that what the witnesses saw was a secret Japanese weapon called the Fu-Go bombing balloon. These devices certainly existed, but were not launched against the United States until 1944. According to Japanese records, design work on them didn't even begin until late 1942, so they couldn't have been used in the attack on Los Angeles. One of the most popular myths about the events of that day is that the craft seen in the sky resembled a giant butterfly. The original source for this story is claimed to have been an article in the Reno Evening Gazette of the 26th of February 1942 with the headline, "Los Angeles Confused Over Air Raid Alarm." A careful study of the news item shows that at no point was any mention made of a giant butterfly being seen. This claim was not put forward until the 1960s following the Mothman UFO sightings. There were various reports of a man-sized flying creature in West Virginia at that time, with the events in 1942 being directly compared with the later ones. Since the Reno Evening Gazette makes no mention of any kind of giant butterfly, that theory can be safely ignored. Neither the media of the time nor eyewitnesses of the events described such a phenomenon. Another myth about the battle is that no attempt was made to scramble aircraft to investigate and take action against any enemy intruder. Nearly an hour passed between the initial air raid alert and the beginning of anti-aircraft fire. The planes, in fact, were on the runways and ready to go into action, but there were not many fighter aircraft in the area, and the decision was made to await developments before committing them to possible aerial combat. Early U.S. radar. Radar is another curious aspect of the events. Officially, the U.S. didn't possess a radar system at the time of the raid, but a government document dated 1983 claims that some form of radar was in existence as early as 1942. It was certainly not as advanced as later radar systems, but it shows that many secret weapons were available to both sides during the war at a much earlier date than previously believed. What are we to make of this strange affair? Clearly, war nerves and the Elwood attack played a part. Even the armed forces appeared confused and gave contradictory accounts of the events of that day. The most significant fact in all of the eyewitness stories is that the anti-aircraft battery that was closest to the phenomenon chose not to open fire. They clearly recognized that whatever they saw was not a hostile aircraft, and so made no attempt to shoot it down. Other battalions with an inferior view of the craft panicked and began firing. The presence of balloons in the area, together with a charged atmosphere among the civilian population, is the most likely explanation for the strange events that have become known as the Battle of Los Angeles. Thank you all so much for listening, and Godspeed.